My name is Claire Morrison. I am 27 years old. And on the morning of my wedding, I stood in the parking lot of a beautiful venue that was locked, dark, and completely empty. 214 guests were pulling into that lot behind me. My dress was on. My flowers were in my hand. And somewhere across town, my mother was sitting at her kitchen table drinking coffee. Certain she had just ended my marriage before it ever began. She had called every single vendor, the caterer, the florist, the DJ, the cake designer, the photographer. She told them all there had been a family emergency. She told them the wedding was canceled. She told some of them that Marcus, the man I had spent 4 years loving, had called it off himself. She thought she had won. What she did not know, what she had no possible way of knowing, was that my best friend and maid of honor, Dani, had discovered what my mother was planning 6 months before the wedding day. 6 months. And in those 6 months, Dani had built something my mother never saw coming. By the time the sun went down on what was supposed to be the worst day of my life, my mother would walk into a room full of people who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had done. This is the story of how I almost lost everything, and how I got back something even greater than a wedding. Before I tell you what happened on the wedding day, I need to take you back to the night everything started. Because the sabotage did not begin when my mother picked up a phone and started canceling vendors. It began the very second Marcus got down on one knee. We were in his apartment in Millbrook, Ohio. It was a regular Thursday. He had made pasta, the same pasta he always burned slightly on the bottom because he refused to lower the heat. I was sitting on the kitchen counter eating directly from the pot because we had not done dishes in 2 days. We were laughing about something stupid. I cannot even remember what. And then Marcus got quiet. He set down the wooden spoon. He turned around. He was holding a ring box that had clearly been sitting in his jacket pocket all evening because the velvet was slightly damp with sweat. He did not rehearse a speech. He just looked at me and said, "I have loved you since that rainy Tuesday at the bookstore when you argued with me for 12 minutes about a book you had never read. I want to argue with you for the rest of my life." I said yes, so fast I knocked over the pot of pasta. We sat on the kitchen floor surrounded by noodles and laughed until we cried. For exactly 18 minutes, the world was perfect. Then my phone rang. Mom. I almost did not answer. I wanted to stay on that floor a little longer, but I picked up, still smiling, still holding the ring box in my other hand. She did not say congratulations. There was no gasp, no cry, no warmth. The first words out of her mouth were, "What kind of venue are you thinking? Because anything decent books 18 months out and you simply cannot afford to wait." I felt something inside me shift. Not enough to ruin the moment, but enough to notice. I told her we had literally just gotten engaged. I told her we had not thought about anything yet. She told me that was irresponsible, that this was the most important day of my life, and I was already behind, that she would start making calls first thing in the morning so nothing slipped through the cracks. Marcus was watching me from across the kitchen. I mouthed the word "Mom" at him. He pressed his lips together and said nothing, but I saw it in his eyes. That particular quiet he carries when he has a thought he has decided not to say out loud yet. I need to explain something about my mother, Margaret, before this story makes complete sense. My father passed away when I was 16. Heart attack. No warning. One morning he was at the breakfast table and then he was simply gone. My mother collapsed inward after that in a way that took years to understand. She was not cruel before his death, but she was not warm either. After? She became something harder to name. She was not abusive in the ways people usually describe. She did not hit me. She did not scream. What she did was quieter and far more effective. She made me feel every single day that my choices were too risky, that my instincts were wrong, that I needed her to survive. When I chose a college 2 states away, she cried for 3 days and told me she was not sure she could manage alone. I transferred home after 1 semester. When I got my own apartment at 23, she called me every morning at 7 and every evening at 9, and somehow made me feel guilty for having a space she was not in. When I started dating Marcus, she told me within the first month that he seemed unstable, that men who were too charming early were hiding something. She had been preparing to control this wedding long before Marcus ever bought that ring. The phone call that Thursday night was not a mother excited for her daughter. It was an opening move. And I was too happy, too in love, too flooded with relief and joy to see it for what it was. Marcus saw it. He just did not know yet how bad it would get. And neither did I. My mother did not storm in and steal the wedding. That is not how she operated. What she did was far more patient and far more calculated. She started with offers. Small, reasonable, almost thoughtful offers. The kind that were hard to say no to without seeming ungrateful. She offered to call the venue because she knew someone on the events board of the Millbrook Garden Hall and could get us a discounted rate. She offered to handle the florist because she had a relationship with a woman from her book club who did arrangements on the side. She offered to coordinate the catering because the caterer we had chosen, a local BBQ place called Hargrove's that Marcus and I both loved, was, in her words, not appropriate for the occasion. I agreed to the venue call. That felt harmless. I did not agree to changing the caterer. Not at first. But here is the thing about the way my mother works. She does not argue with you directly. She does not force. She wears you down in layers. She would bring up the catering at every single conversation. Not loudly, not aggressively. She would simply mention it the way you mention weather. I was thinking again about the food and whether BBQ sends the right message. Then, 2 days later, I just think your father's side of the family would expect something a little more formal. Then, a week later, a long silence followed by. I just want people to respect you, Claire. That is all I have ever wanted. By month 2 of the planning process, I had agreed to a formal catering company I had never heard of, flowers I did not pick, and a seating arrangement that had been rearranged 3 times without my input. Dani noticed before I did. Dani Chen has been my best friend since we were 11 years old. We grew up 2 streets apart in the same suburb and survived the same middle school cafeteria together. She is the kind of person who notices everything and says nothing until she has thought it through completely. When Dani finally speaks, it is not to vent. It is because she has already formed a plan. About 3 months into the planning, Dani took me to coffee and very carefully, very kindly, asked me to walk her through every decision that had been made about the wedding so far. Not to judge, just to listen. I talked for 45 minutes. When I finished, Dani set down her cup and said, "Claire, how many of those decisions were actually yours?" I opened my mouth to answer. I closed it again. I went through the list in my head. The venue, my mother's contact. The flowers, my mother's book club friend. The catering, replaced after weeks of quiet pressure. The color palette, suggested so firmly by my mother that I had simply adopted it. The ceremony time, adjusted because my mother's sisters were flying in and needed a later start. I had chosen the dress. That was the one thing that was entirely mine. My mother had come to the appointment and had steered me toward a more classic silhouette, but the final choice had been mine. That was it. Dani watched my face go through about 14 different emotions and said, "I am not trying to upset you, but I think you need to start paying attention to how this is moving." I told her she was being dramatic. I told her my mother was just enthusiastic, and that I had been busy with work and it made sense to let her help. I told her it was fine. Dani looked at me with that steady, patient look she has had since we were 11 and said, "Okay, just okay. No argument, no pushback, no, I told you so, filed for later." She just nodded and changed the subject. But I would find out much later that after that coffee, Dani went home and started keeping a record. Dates, conversations, screenshots, every single thing my mother touched. Because Dani had already started to understand what I had not yet admitted to myself. This was not going to end well without a plan. There is a moment in every situation where you stop making excuses and finally see the truth. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a florist's shop, and it was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that breaks you open slowly. I had taken a half day from work. I taught fourth grade at Millbrook Elementary, and I had been running on almost no sleep for 2 weeks, trying to keep up with lesson planning, parent conferences, and wedding logistics that kept expanding in ways I could not control. I decided to stop in at Hargrove Florals, the shop my mother had originally engaged, to check in on the arrangements. The woman at the counter, whose name I had memorized because I had spoken to her 4 times over the past 2 months, looked at me with a polite but slightly confused expression. "Your mother came in last week," she said. "She made some adjustments." I smiled the way you smile when you already feel the floor tilting beneath you. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked. She turned her monitor toward me. The entire order had been changed. Not slightly, not in minor ways. The sunflowers I had specifically requested, the loose wildflower arrangement I had described in detail, and had been genuinely excited about. The pops of yellow and peach and soft lavender I had imagined lining the ceremony aisle. All of it was gone. In its place was a white and ivory arrangement built entirely around formal roses. The kind of flowers you see in a department store, advertisement for something that costs twice as much and means half as much. My mother had also, I learned in that same conversation, listed herself as the primary contact on the account. Her number, her email, her approval required for any changes. Mine had been removed. I stood very still at that counter for a long moment. I thanked the florist. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and did not move for about 6 minutes. Then I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, and I could tell immediately from his voice that he had been waiting for this call. Not this specific call, but something like it. "She changed the flowers," I said. A beat of silence. Then, "Tell me exactly what happened." I told him. And as I was telling him, I heard myself saying the words out loud for the first time, as full sentences and not as partial thoughts I had been pushing to the back of my mind. My mother had changed the catering. My mother had rearranged the seating chart. My mother had altered the ceremony timeline. My mother had made herself the primary contact on the florist account. My mother had, in the past 4 months, systematically made herself the architect of a wedding that was supposed to belong to me and to Marcus. When I finished, Marcus said, "Claire, I need to tell you something I have been holding back because I did not want to put you in the middle." He told me that 6 weeks earlier, my mother had called him directly. Not to talk about the wedding, to talk about him. She had told him that she had concerns, that she had done some research, that she had spoken to someone who knew his family and had heard things that worried her. She implied, without ever saying it directly, that he was not the kind of man who would stay, that I was too trusting, that she was trying to protect me. He had not told me because he did not want me to feel torn. I sat in that parking lot and felt something shift inside me that I had never felt before. It was not just anger, it was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop protecting someone's image and finally see who they actually are. My mother was not helping me plan a wedding. She was trying to dismantle one, and I had let her into every single corner of it. I called Dani on the drive home. She picked up before the first ring had finished. "I know," she said. And then she told me what she had been keeping for 3 months. Dani had known for 3 months. Not everything, not the full extent of it, but enough. She had built a file. When I arrived at her apartment that evening, she had it spread out on her kitchen table. Printed emails, screenshots of text messages, a handwritten log of dates and events and phone calls. It looked like something you would see in a true crime documentary, and it made my chest tight just looking at it. She walked me through it calmly. It had started with a conversation Dani had overheard at my mother's house 2 months before the engagement. She had gone there to pick me up for a birthday dinner, and I had been running late from work. My mother had been on the phone, not knowing Dani was in the hallway, and Dani had heard pieces of a conversation that did not make sense at the time, but that lodged in her memory. My mother had been talking to someone about Marcus, asking questions about his financial history, about a previous relationship he had been in before we met, about whether there was anything that could be used to open Claire's eyes before it was too late. Dani had not known what to do with that, so she had filed it away and started watching. Over the following months, she had noticed the vendor changes. She had noticed the way my mother talked about Marcus when I was not in the room. She had talked to the venue coordinator, a woman named Patrice, who had been quietly troubled by some of the requests my mother had been making. And Patrice had told her that my mother had asked, twice, whether deposits were refundable and under what circumstances a booking could be cancelled without the primary party's knowledge. Not without the primary party's consent. Without the primary party's knowledge. Dani had also found out, through a mutual friend of my mother's who did not realize she was speaking to me by extension, that my mother had reached out to Marcus's ex-girlfriend, a woman named Renata who had dated him briefly 3 years before I met him. My mother had apparently told Renata that Marcus was engaged to someone young and inexperienced, and that if Renata had any reservations she wanted to share, now was the time. Renata had actually reached back out to Dani after the conversation because she was disturbed by it. She wanted to know if I was okay. She said my mother had tried to convince her that Marcus had behaved badly during their relationship and had asked her to confirm details that Renata said were simply not true. My mother had been trying to manufacture a reason to end the engagement. When Dani finished walking me through the file, she poured us both a glass of water and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "How long have you been sitting on this?" I asked. 3 months, she said. "I was waiting until you were ready to hear it." "Why didn't you push me sooner?" "Because the last time I raised a concern, you defended her," she said. Not accusatory, just honest. "I needed you to arrive here on your own." She was right. I knew she was right. And I hated it and loved her for it at the same time. I asked her what we should do, and this is the moment that defined everything that followed. Dani did not say we should confront my mother. She did not say we should cut her out. She did not say we should call off the wedding or move the timeline or bring in lawyers. She leaned forward, folded her hands on top of the file, and said, "We let her finish." I stared at her. "We let her do whatever she is planning to do," Dani said. "And then, we make sure that when she does it, every single person who matters is watching." I did not fully understand what she meant yet, but I said yes. Because Dani Chen has never once steered me wrong, and whatever she was building, I trusted it completely. Over the next 6 weeks, Dani did something I still cannot fully explain without marveling at it. She quietly and methodically built a second wedding behind the first one. She did not tell me every step. She told me what I needed to know and kept the rest protected. Her reasoning was careful and, as I later understood, completely strategic. The less I knew, the less I could accidentally reveal. My mother was perceptive. She watched me closely. If I behaved differently or pulled back from her involvement, she would change her approach, and we would lose the element of surprise. So my job was to appear exactly as I had always appeared. Slightly overwhelmed, grateful for the help, loving, accommodating, and unsuspecting. It was the hardest performance of my life. My mother came over twice a week during those 6 weeks. She sat at my kitchen table with spreadsheets and binders and talked about centerpiece heights and place card fonts. I nodded. I agreed. I thanked her. Every single time she turned around or reached into her bag, I felt my jaw tighten. Meanwhile, Dani was working. She contacted Hargrove Florals and opened a separate account in her own name, listing me as a secondary contact. She was careful and honest with them. She told the florist that there had been a family complication and she was quietly building a backup arrangement to protect the wedding. The florist, who had already been made uncomfortable by my mother's behavior and the removal of my contact information, agreed without hesitation. Dani ordered the exact flowers I had originally described: sunflowers, lavender, wildflowers, loose and warm and alive. She also contacted Hargrove's BBQ, the caterer my mother had dismissed. She explained the situation. The owner, a man named Gerald Hargrove, was so moved that he offered to hold the date and work with a reduced deposit, because he said in his 20 years of catering, he had never heard of anything like it, and he was not going to let someone's wedding be swallowed up by something that wrong. Dani reached back out to the original photographer, who had been told the booking was canceled but had not yet removed the date from her calendar. When Dani explained what had happened, the photographer agreed to honor the original contract. She found a second DJ. She sourced a backup venue. A restored farmhouse property about 8 minutes from the original location, owned by a family friend of Marcus's, who offered it at no charge when he heard the full story. Then she did something I never would have thought to do. She documented everything in real time and quietly informed key guests. Not all 200. She was selective. She told Marcus's mother. She told my closest aunt, who had always quietly disagreed with my mother's controlling tendencies, but never said anything directly. She told the pastor who was officiating the ceremony. She told 3 of my mother's closest friends, the ones who had the most influence in her social circle, the ones whose opinions she cared about the most. She did not tell them what my mother was planning to do. She told them what my mother had already done: the vendor manipulation, the attempted contact with Renata, the refundability questions, the removal of my information from vendor accounts. She showed them the file. 2 of those 3 friends went very quiet after reading it. The third one cried. Dani asked all of them to attend the wedding and to say nothing in advance. She asked them to simply be present, to watch, to know. Because if my mother went through with what Dani believed she was planning, the room would not be filled with confused and sympathetic onlookers. The room would be filled with witnesses, people who already knew, people who would see it for exactly what it was. I learned about all of this in pieces over those 6 weeks. Each time Dani told me a new development, I felt something strange and powerful building in my chest. Not just gratitude. Something more like the feeling of the ground returning beneath your feet after a long fall. The wedding was 12 days away. And then my mother made her move. She did it on a Wednesday. The wedding was 11 days away. I was in my classroom after school hours grading a stack of reading assessments when my phone started buzzing. Not once, not twice, 4 times in 3 minutes. I looked down and saw Dani's name, then the florist's name, then an unknown number that I would later find out was the catering manager at the formal catering company my mother had insisted on booking. I called Dani first. She answered immediately, and her voice was steady, the way it gets when she has already processed something and arrived at the other side of it. She did it, Dani said. Today. She called them all. I sat down in my chair and pressed my hand flat against the desk. How many? I asked. All of them. The venue, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, the DJ, the cake designer, the shuttle company. Every vendor connected to the wedding, every single one. My mother had called each of them and identified herself as the family representative. She told the venue that the wedding was being called off due to a family emergency and to release the date. She told the caterer the same. She told the photographer there had been a personal crisis and the ceremony would not be taking place. She told the DJ the event was canceled. She told the cake designer to hold the order but do not deliver. She had not just canceled the wedding. She had done it systematically, efficiently, and thoroughly. She had used her position as the account contact, the position she had spent months quietly building, to dismantle everything in a single afternoon. Then she called Marcus. This is the part that still makes my breathing change when I think about it. She called Marcus directly and told him that I had been having second thoughts for months, that I had confided in her, that I was too afraid to say it to his face, that she was calling on my behalf because she was concerned about what would happen if I tried to have this conversation alone. She told him that she thought deep down I already knew I was not ready and that he deserved to know the truth. Marcus listened to the entire phone call without interrupting her. Then he said, "Margaret, I am going to stop you right there." He told her that Claire had not confided anything in her, that he and Claire spoke every single day and had not had a single conversation that resembled what she was describing. He told her that he knew about the vendor account changes. He told her he knew about the call to Renata. He told her that Dani had been documenting everything for 3 months. And then he said something that I think about often because it was so calm and so precise. He said, "I am going to ask you one question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you love your daughter, or do you love your control over her? Because what you are doing right now has nothing to do with love, and everyone is about to find out." My mother hung up. She called me 4 minutes later. She was crying. Soft, exhausted-sounding tears, the kind she had always deployed when she felt a situation slipping from her grip. She told me she was worried. She told me she had made some calls to protect me. She told me she had done what any mother would do for a daughter she loved. I let her finish. Then I said, "I know exactly what you did, Mom. Every call, every vendor, every single one." She went quiet. "I want you to come to the wedding," I said. "I want you to be there." A pause. "I will be there," she said. She thought that was her victory. She thought I was crumbling. She thought that one soft phone call had returned her to the position she had always occupied in my life. She had no idea that I wanted her there precisely because of what she was going to find when she arrived. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5:47 and lay completely still for about 2 minutes in the gray early light of my apartment. Marcus was at his brother's place for the night. Dani had slept over and I could hear her already moving around in the kitchen. I could smell coffee and something sweet. Maybe the banana bread she sometimes made when she needed to feel productive and calm at the same time. I got up. I put on the oversized sweater I had owned since college. I walked into the kitchen. Dani looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup and said, "Ready?" And the thing was, I was. Completely. The nervousness I had expected to feel that morning, about Marcus, about the ceremony, about the vows, was not there. I was not nervous about any of that. What I felt was something cleaner, quieter. Like the feeling before the first line of a very important test, when you have studied and you know the material, and you are simply ready to begin. The backup venue had been set up the night before by Dani and a group of 8 friends who had spent 4 hours stringing lights, arranging tables, and laying out the wildflower centerpieces that Gerald Hargrove's wife had delivered that afternoon. I had not seen it yet. Dani had kept it from me deliberately because she wanted my reaction on the day to be real. At 7:30, she drove me there. I will try to describe it accurately, but I do not think words fully contain it. The farmhouse property sat on about 3 acres of open land with old oak trees along the fence line. The ceremony area was outdoors, under a wooden arch that someone had woven with sunflowers and trailing lavender. The tables for the reception were in a converted barn that had been cleaned and strung with warm Edison lights from end to end. The wildflower arrangements were everywhere, yellow and peach and soft green, and exactly the way I had described them in a florist's office 6 months earlier, before my mother had erased them. Hargrove's BBQ was setting up along the side wall of the barn. The smell was already reaching me from the parking lot. I stood at the entrance of the barn and could not speak for almost a full minute. Dani stood beside me and said nothing. Then I turned to her and said, "How?" And she smiled the way she smiles when she has been holding something for a long time and is finally setting it down. "Because you deserved it," she said, "and because no one was going to take this from you." At 8:15, my phone buzzed, a text from my Aunt Patricia, who was one of the people Dani had informed 6 weeks earlier. It said, "Your mother just texted me. She is on her way to the original venue. She is expecting to arrive and see the fallout. She wants me to come with her to support you." I texted back 3 words. "Let her come." At 9 a.m., guests began arriving at the farmhouse. Many of them had received the updated address the night before through a message sent by Dani from an account they did not recognize, containing only the address and the words, "Same day, same time, new address. Claire and Marcus can't wait to see you." Most guests were confused. Many texted me. I responded to all of them warmly. "I will explain everything at the reception. Just come." By 10:15, 189 guests were seated in and around the barn. Marcus arrived at 10:22 with his brother and 2 best friends, and when he saw the arch with the sunflowers, he pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment. Then he looked at me, and the look on his face was the kind of look that stays in your memory for the rest of your life. At 10:35, my phone buzzed one more time. Patricia again. "She is pulling into the original venue now. It is empty. She has no idea where everyone is." I put my phone face down on the chair beside me. The ceremony was about to begin. My mother arrived at the farmhouse at 12:47 in the afternoon. The ceremony had already happened. Marcus and I had said our vows at 11 in the morning under that sunflower arch, with the oak trees behind us and 189 people watching. I had cried. Marcus had cried. The pastor had nearly cried. Dani had stood beside me in a dusty rose dress holding my sunflower bouquet and had somehow maintained her composure through the entire ceremony, which I consider one of the greatest acts of willpower I have ever witnessed. By the time my mother walked through the barn doors, we were in the middle of the reception. The tables were full. The music was playing. Hargrove's BBQ was being served. The air smelled like pulled pork and cornbread and summer, and something that could only be described as exactly right. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. I was at the head table and I saw her the second she appeared. She was wearing a structured cream blazer and her hair was done, and she looked, from the outside, like a composed woman arriving late to a celebration, but I could see her face. She was scanning the room, processing, the barn, the wildflowers, the food she had called inappropriate, the photographer moving through the crowd, the DJ she had told was canceled, the cake on the display table that she had instructed not to be delivered, all of it present, all of it exactly as it should have been. Her eyes found me at the head table. She took one step forward. That is when my Aunt Patricia stood up from her table. Patricia had been one of my mother's closest friends for 23 years. They had grown up together. They had been in each other's weddings. Patricia was the person my mother called when things fell apart. Patricia walked toward my mother and stopped directly in front of her. She did not raise her voice. The music was still playing. Conversations were still happening. But Patricia looked at my mother and said, quietly and clearly, "Margaret, I know what you did. And so does everyone else at this table." My mother's expression shifted. Something flickered across her face that I had never seen there before. Not guilt, exactly. Not remorse. It was closer to the particular shock of someone who has always operated from a position of complete certainty and has just discovered, for the first time, that the ground beneath them is not as solid as they believed. Two of her other close friends, the women Dani had spoken to 6 weeks earlier, were watching from across the room. Neither of them waved. Neither of them smiled. They simply watched. My mother turned and looked for an ally. The familiar social reflex of a woman who had spent decades knowing exactly where to look for a sympathetic audience. There was none. Not because people were hostile. Not because the room had turned into something ugly. The music was still playing. People were still eating and laughing. My wedding was, in every possible way, exactly what it was supposed to be. But every person who mattered to my mother knew. And she could feel it the way you feel a temperature drop in a room when a window opens somewhere you cannot see. She walked toward me. I stood up from my chair. For a moment we just looked at each other. My mother in her structured blazer, holding her composure with both hands. Me in my wedding dress, next to the man she had tried to convince was wrong for me, surrounded by flowers she had tried to erase, and food she had called inappropriate, and people she had tried to exclude. "You planned this," she said. It was not a question. "We planned this," I said, "because you gave us no other choice." She opened her mouth. And then Marcus stood up beside me and put his hand on my back. Steady and calm and present, and simply stood there. My mother looked at his hand. She looked at my face. She looked at the room around us. And for the first time in my entire life, she had nothing to say. What followed was not a scene. That is the thing I most want you to understand. The revenge, if you can even call it that, was not a screaming match. There was no dramatic speech in front of the guests. There was no public humiliation. There was no moment where I stood up on a chair and announced what my mother had done. That was never Dani's plan. It had never been my plan. The reckoning was quieter than that. And because of that, it was complete. My mother sat down at a table near the back of the barn. She sat there for almost an hour while the reception went on around her. She watched people eat the food she had called inappropriate. She watched the flowers she had replaced with formal roses fill every corner of the room with color and light and wildness. She watched Marcus and me dance to a song we had chosen together. She watched her own closest friends decline to come to her table. They were not cruel. Dani had not asked anyone to be cruel. She had simply given them the truth and let them decide what to do with it. What they decided was to give their loyalty to me. After my first dance with Marcus, I walked to my mother's table and sat down across from her. She looked older in that moment than I had ever seen her look. Not physically. Something behind her eyes had shifted. The certainty that had always lived there. That absolute, unwavering certainty that she knew best and loved hardest and was always, always right, was fractured in a way I do not think either of us fully expected. I did not come to that table to punish her. I came because she was still my mother. And because I understood, in a way I could not have understood a year earlier, that the woman sitting across from me was not simply cruel. She was frightened. She had been frightened since the morning my father died, and she had spent 11 years constructing a world in which she could not lose anything else by controlling everything within reach. I still do not excuse what she did. I want to be clear about that. She tried to end my marriage before it started. She manufactured lies about the man I love. She spent months systematically dismantling something that was supposed to be mine. That is not something you excuse. That is something you survive and then decide, with full clarity, how much space to allow it going forward. But I did not want to end my relationship with my mother. I wanted to change it. I told her that what she had done had consequences she was now living with. That the people in this room knew what she had tried to do. That rebuilding trust after something like this would take time and would look different than anything we had practiced before. That there would be boundaries now. Real ones. and that I needed her to understand that those boundaries were not rejection. They were conditions for a relationship that could actually continue. She was quiet through all of it. She nodded. Her eyes were wet. At the end, she said, "I did not want to lose you." I said, "You almost did." The difference between those two things is the entire story. Gerald Hargrove's cornbread was extraordinary. The photographer captured a picture of Marcus and me laughing at our table that I have kept on my nightstand ever since. Dani made a toast that was so perfectly balanced between funny and sincere that it got a standing ovation. The Edison lights in the barn stayed on until 11 o'clock at night when the last guests finally pulled themselves away. It was not the wedding my mother had planned. It was not the formal, controlled, perfectly arranged event she had constructed over months of quiet maneuvering. It was mine. Entirely and completely mine. And that, in the end, was the only revenge that ever mattered. My mother and I are in therapy together. It is slow. It is honest. Some days it is very hard, but it is real in a way that nothing between us ever was before, and the wildflowers were perfect. I used to think the hardest part of this story was what my mother did. Now I think the hardest part was recognizing the pattern I had lived inside for 27 years and choosing, for the first time, to step outside of it. Not with anger, not with a performance, but with a quiet, unshakable decision to simply show up for my own life. Dani taught me that the most powerful response to someone who tries to take everything from you is not a fight. It is preparation. It is patience. It is making sure that when the moment comes, the truth is already in the room. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something or recognize something, then you already know why you watched until the end. Stories like this one matter because they remind us that the people who try to reduce us most are often the ones who are most afraid of our full size. Thank you for being here with me. If you want more stories that are honest, raw, and real, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. The next story that is coming. It will leave you completely speechless.